I had never imagined that a weekend getaway with friends to a secluded cabin in the woods would turn into a living nightmare. We had been planning this trip for months. A perfect escape to disconnect from the world, away from the noise, social media, and work stress. Just me and my closest friends, 4 of us in total, on a retreat to clear our heads, reconnect with nature, and have some fun. But from the moment we arrived, I knew something was wrong. The cabin was old, rustic, nestled deep in the forest where the trees seemed to whisper with the wind. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine, damp earth, and something unsettling. It was the kind of place you'd find in horror movies, but I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It had been a long drive, and all I wanted was to unpack, crack open a cold beer, and relax. We arrived just before dusk, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the property. The cabin had a large porch with rocking chairs, surrounded by towering trees, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze. It looked picturesque, almost too perfect to be real. It was isolated, with no other houses nearby, just dense forest stretching as far as the eye could see. That should have been my first red flag, but I ignored it. Inside, the cabin was just as rustic as the outside. Wooden floors, exposed beams, and an old stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a heavy feeling in the air, like the place had absorbed decades of silence, the kind of silence that felt too loud. We unpacked our bags and decided to make dinner. As we ate, we joked about how creepy the cabin was, but no one really meant it. We were here to relax, after all. Later, we set up around the fire pit outside. The night had fallen quickly, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Hey, anyone ever heard of any weird stories about this place?" I asked, trying to keep the mood light. My friend Jessica, who was the least superstitious of us, laughed. "Not unless you count the local legends. Something about an old family that disappeared in these woods years ago. But it's all just stories to scare tourists." I laughed along with her, but my gut twisted. There was something off about this place. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like we were being observed by unseen eyes, hidden just beyond the tree line. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We all retreated to our rooms, and I, for one, couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees outside, and every creak of the old cabin seemed amplified in the silence. I tried to ignore it and eventually fell into a fitful sleep. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud bang that echoed through the cabin. My heart raced, and I froze in bed, straining to hear. Was it the wind, or was something else out there? I could hear muffled voices from the other rooms. My friends were awake too, all of us shaken by the same eerie noise. I got out of bed, my legs weak as I crept down the hall to the living room. When I arrived, I found Jessica, Mark, and Ryan huddled together on the couch, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's not the wind," Jessica said, her voice shaky. Something's out there." We all stood in silence, listening. The house was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind that made the trees creak like ancient giants. Then, a soft scratching noise started at the window. Slow, deliberate, like something, or someone, was dragging their nails across the glass. None of us moved. We just stared at each other, our breath coming in shallow gasps. The scratching stopped abruptly, and the silence returned, more suffocating than before. But the unease didn't dissipate. If anything, it deepened. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a branch brushing against the window, maybe an animal. But then we heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable. It came from outside, from the direction of the forest, just beyond the tree line. "Help me." It was weak, almost a whisper, but we all heard it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Jessica was the first to speak. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice shaking. But there was no answer, just that same eerie silence. I didn't want to go outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was trying to communicate with us. Mark grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The cold night air hit us like a slap to the face as we stepped outside, shining the beam of light in all directions. The woods around us were dark, too dark to see anything more than a few feet away. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the crunch of dry leaves beneath our feet as we walked. We moved cautiously, the beam of the flashlight bouncing nervously from one tree to another. Suddenly, we froze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing just inside the tree line. It was tall, its features obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the sense of dread it radiated. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at us. My stomach twisted with a sickening realization. This wasn't some lost wanderer or prankster. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. We backed away slowly, our eyes never leaving the figure. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, disappeared into the darkness like smoke swallowed by the wind. "Did you see that?" Ryan whispered, his voice cracking. None of us answered. We were all thinking the same thing. Whatever that was, it wasn't human. We rushed back inside, slamming the door shut behind us. My hands were trembling as I locked the door, and I could feel the other's eyes on me, waiting for an explanation I didn't have. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. We didn't sleep. We couldn't. The fear gnawed at us, kept us awake, kept us listening for the faintest sound, the slightest movement outside. We kept the lights on, all of them, and huddled together in the living room, too terrified to even go to the bathroom alone. In the morning, we left. We didn't even wait to pack up our things. We piled into the car, drove as fast as we could, and didn't stop until we reached a gas station on the main highway. We didn't speak to each other the entire drive. When I got home, I tried to forget about that night, tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew the truth. That cabin was never just a getaway spot. It was a place that held dark memories, dark forces, something that had never left, something that still wandered those woods, watching and waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to wander into its grasp. And every time I close my eyes, I can still see that figure standing at the edge of the trees, waiting for me.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts, never gave much thought to those old horror stories people told around the campfire. But now, as I sit here, alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, I wish I could take back every moment I mocked those tales. I wish I could go back to the days before the terror came, before I saw what I saw. But all I can do now is tell you the truth. The full, horrifying truth. It all started when I decided to take a weekend getaway. A break from the city. My job had been wearing me down for months, and I needed to clear my head. So I rented a cabin up in the mountains, somewhere far off the grid. A tiny, secluded place, about a 3-hour drive from town, nestled between dark forests and towering peaks. The kind of place you hear about in scary stories. The kind of place you think that would be a great place to get away from everything. I should have known better. I got there just as the sun was setting, the sky turning a brilliant orange pink as the night crept in. The air was crisp, fresh, completely different from the polluted atmosphere of the city. I parked the car outside, grabbed my bags, and made my way up the stone steps to the front door. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, old, wooden, a little worn down. It had a certain charm, though, the kind of charm that's often found in forgotten places. The door creaked as I opened it, a soft protest that made me chuckle. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was the building settling, but I didn't think much of it. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of pine and wood smoke. It had the typical cozy vibe. A small fireplace, a couple of armchairs, a kitchen with an old stove, and a bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. I quickly unpacked, started a fire, and opened a bottle of wine, determined to enjoy the solitude. The first night went by uneventfully. The wind howled outside, and the trees shook against the windows, but that was the kind of noise you expect when you're in the wilderness. But then, it started. The first thing I noticed was the scratching sound. It was faint at first, like a twig brushing against the window or an animal trying to get inside. I figured it was a raccoon or some other critter, so I didn't think much of it. But it kept going. The scratching wasn't random. It had a pattern to it, a slow, methodical rhythm, almost like someone was tapping their nails against the wood. I stood up and went to the window to check, but saw nothing, just the dark trees swaying in the wind. My heart began to race, but I shrugged it off and returned to my chair. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the room, and I tried to lose myself in the book I had brought with me. But then I heard it. A voice. Not loud, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It was a whisper, a soft, eerie sound that came from somewhere in the cabin. I froze, my skin prickled, my breath caught in my throat. The voice said, "Get out." I whipped my head around, scanning the room. The fire flickered, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I was alone. I had been alone since I arrived. There was no one here but me. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but the signal was dead. No bars, no service. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to steady my breath. The voice, that whisper. It couldn't have been real. I must have imagined it, right? I looked around trying to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. It was just the wind, or maybe it was the old wood creaking. The house was old, after all, but as I turned back to the fire, I saw something. A figure. At the edge of the room, standing in the shadows. It was tall and thin. Too thin. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but I could see its outline, the way it hunched over, the way it seemed to loom closer, almost as if it was part of the shadows themselves. I backed away slowly, my heart racing in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen by fear. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching me. I couldn't tell if it was real. My eyes couldn't focus. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, vanishing into the darkness like smoke. I waited for a moment, then another. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but something told me it wasn't. Slowly, I moved to the door, my eyes darting around, checking every corner, every shadow. I fumbled for the key, almost too terrified to turn it, but the door was locked. I ran to the windows, hoping to escape, but every one of them was sealed tight, as if the cabin itself had trapped me inside. I heard the voice again, only this time it was louder, more distinct. "Get out! You're not welcome here." I stumbled back from the window, my body shaking with fear. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, as if the very walls of the cabin were alive, whispering in unison. Then the scratching started again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just outside the window. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, the ceiling. The sound was deafening, maddening. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't breathe. I ran. I don't even know how I moved so fast. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but my mind was set on one thing: escape. I stumbled through the dark, past the kitchen, the living room, and into the hallway, but the shadows seemed to stretch and grow around me. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, groaning like the house itself was in pain. And then, right in front of me, I saw it. The door to the basement. The door that wasn't there when I arrived. It was new, fresh, with old iron hinges that creaked when I looked at them. I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to even acknowledge its existence. But I had no choice. The voice was closer now, louder. "Come down. Come and see." I felt like I was losing my mind. Every part of me screamed to leave, but my legs betrayed me. I was walking toward the door, compelled by something beyond my control. The scratching intensified, and I could hear whispers now. Whispers of people, of things that shouldn't exist. I reached for the door and it opened without resistance. I didn't want to go down there, but I had no choice. The basement was cold, unnaturally cold. The air was thick, heavy, and it smelled like decay. I descended the stairs, one slow step at a time, my breath coming in short gasps. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. The walls of the basement were covered in scratches, deep, jagged marks, some of them old, some fresh, and in the center of the room was a pile of something. Bones. Old, brittle bones that looked like they had been there for decades. And then I saw the writing scratched into the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Words that didn't make sense, but somehow they did. Words that called to me, words that filled me with dread. I couldn't escape. I ran back up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I tried to unlock it, but I couldn't. The door wouldn't budge. The whispers were growing louder, and the scratching came again. It was everywhere, in my mind, in my soul. The cabin was alive, and it wanted me. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know how I escaped, but I did. And now I'm here telling you this, telling you to never, under any circumstances, stay in a cabin like the one I stayed in. Because it's not just the wind you hear at night. It's something else, something far older. And when it wants you, it won't stop until it has you. So please, if you're ever out there in the mountains, far from home, keep your distance, because some things are better left undisturbed.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. Never. Even after what happened, part of me still doesn't want to believe. It's easier that way, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me back from that cabin. It started out as a simple weekend getaway. My friends and I had been planning it for months. Escape the city, get some fresh air, a little fishing, maybe hike a bit. Nothing too extravagant, just a place to unwind. We found this old secluded cabin online, like deep in the woods of upstate New York. The listing claimed it was rustic but charming, with no neighbors for miles. Perfect for a quiet retreat. When we arrived, the place looked just like the pictures. A small two-story cabin made of weathered wood, surrounded by towering trees. The air smelled fresh like pine and damp earth. There was a small stream that ran nearby, and the only sound at night was the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. But I brushed off any odd feelings. We were there to relax, after all. There were 4 of us: me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Tyler, and my cousin Jake. We unpacked, settled in, and cracked open some beers. The cabin was cozy enough, with a fireplace that crackled to life as soon as we lit it. There was a sense of old-world charm to the place. Vintage furniture, old paintings on the walls, bookshelves filled with dusty novels. Everything seemed so normal. That night, after a long day of hiking and fishing, we gathered around the fireplace to play cards and tell stories. There was a storm rolling in, with thunder rumbling in the distance, but it didn't stop us from having a good time. We joked about the local legends of the area, stories of disappearances, strange happenings, things that go bump in the night. Just some harmless fun to get into the spirit of the trip. But as the night wore on, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, but there was a strange stillness to the cabin that felt off. I dismissed it, thinking it was just the storm making me jittery. Sarah noticed I was fidgeting, so she suggested we go to bed. We all agreed. The cabin had 3 bedrooms. Tyler and Sarah took the master bedroom upstairs. Jake and I took the room downstairs. There was something about the bedroom I couldn't shake, though. The air felt thick, like it was holding on to something. I told myself it was just the age of the cabin, the old wood creaking with the storm. But as I lay there, in the dark, I could feel eyes on me. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. It was like someone or something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but it clung to me like a shadow. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, until I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It came from the far corner of the room, near the window. I told myself it was just a branch, maybe blown by the wind. But the sound was too deliberate, too close. My heart began to race as I slowly turned my head to the corner. There was nothing there, just the old window, the curtains swaying with the draft. I sighed in relief and closed my eyes again, trying to ignore the growing feeling of dread in my chest. But then came the whisper. It was so faint that I almost thought I imagined it, but it came again, clearer this time. A voice, low, raspy, just a single word whispered directly into my ear. Help! My blood ran cold. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my throat. I looked around the room, but there was no one there. The window was shut tight, the curtains still. Jake was sound asleep on the other side of the room, snoring lightly. I couldn't breathe. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on me. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the door, throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway. I couldn't get away from that feeling of being watched. Every step I took, every turn I made, I felt it, closer and closer. I ran upstairs to Sarah and Tyler's room. I didn't even knock. I just burst through the door. They both shot up in bed, alarmed by my sudden entrance. "What the hell, Maddie?" Sarah asked, her voice groggy with sleep. I heard something in the room. "A voice," I said, trying to catch my breath. Tyler sat up, his eyes wide. "What kind of voice?" "I don't know. It was like whispering. It said, 'Help.'" For a moment there was silence. Then Tyler shrugged it off. "You were probably just dreaming, Maddie. The storm's making weird noises." But I knew what I heard. It wasn't a dream. It was too real. I didn't want to seem crazy, but the look on Sarah's face told me she wasn't so sure. She got up and went to the window, peering outside into the stormy night. "There's nothing out there," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're just spooked, Maddie." I tried to calm myself, but the unease wouldn't leave. After a while, I crawled into bed with them. The storm raged outside, but the cabin felt suffocatingly silent. The next morning, I tried to put it out of my mind. Maybe I had just been overly tired, or maybe the storm had messed with my head. But as we sat down to breakfast, eggs and bacon that Sarah had cooked up, I noticed something strange. There were scratches on the door frame. Tiny, almost imperceptible marks, but enough to make me wonder how they got there. They looked like claw marks. I didn't notice those last night, I said, my voice shaky. Tyler squinted at them. Probably from the storm. The wind's been battering the place all night. But I wasn't convinced. There was something more to it. The door frame wasn't the only strange thing. Over the next few days, more odd occurrences started happening. The lights flickered, objects were moved, strange sounds echoed through the walls at night. At first, we chalked it up to the old building settling, but as the days went on, it became harder to ignore. One night, we were sitting by the fire when we heard footsteps above us. Heavy, deliberate steps, like someone walking across the floor upstairs. We were all downstairs, and none of us had gone up there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I'll go check," Jake volunteered, ever the skeptic. He climbed the stairs, and we waited in silence, the only sound, the crackling of the fire. After what felt like an eternity, he came back down, his face pale. "There's no one up there, but..." His voice trailed off. "But what?" Sarah asked. "There's something strange. The bed. It's pushed up against the wall. It wasn't like that when we got here." We all exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't just the bed. The whole house felt wrong. I don't know how else to explain it. The air was heavy, like something was pressing down on us. The next morning, we packed up early. None of us spoke about it, but we all knew it was time to go. As we loaded up the car, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin. There, standing at the window of the upstairs room, was a figure. A shadow, dark and indistinct, watching us. I didn't wait. I turned, grabbed my bag, and got into the car. We left without saying another word. I still don't know what happened in that cabin. I don't know if it was the house, or something that lived there, or maybe something older, something that followed us from the woods. All I know is that after that trip, things haven't felt right. Sometimes I hear whispers in the dark. Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched. I try not to think about it too much, but every time I close my eyes at night, I feel that presence again, lingering just outside my reach. It never left.
Next story.
The wind howled through the trees, sending sharp gusts of air that rattled the old cabin's windows. I'd been driving for hours, my tired eyes scanning the winding road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the forest. It was supposed to be a quick solo retreat, a way to clear my head. My therapist had suggested a weekend getaway to disconnect, to reset. And what better place than this secluded cabin, tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains, far from the distractions of my daily life? I'd found the cabin on a little-known rental site, and the photos looked idyllic, a charming little cabin in the woods, perfect for solitude. The listing mentioned a peaceful location, a stream nearby, and hiking trails that led through the dense forest. It sounded exactly like what I needed, quiet, serene, and isolated. Maybe a little too isolated, I thought, as I reached the final stretch of road. The GPS lost signal as I approached the cabin, and the last stretch was a bumpy dirt road that seemed to get narrower the further I went. The trees on either side were so dense that they blocked most of the light from the setting sun. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, it was almost dark. The cabin was exactly as advertised. Small but cozy, built of rough-hewn logs that had darkened with age. The front porch had a couple of rocking chairs and a small wooden table with a lantern. It looked peaceful, even inviting, but there was an odd stillness in the air. No sounds from the forest, no birds, no rustling of leaves. Just quiet. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and made my way to the front door. The key was hidden in a small box by the door, just as the host had told me. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was warm and rustic, with a large stone fireplace in the center of the room. A fire was already going in the hearth, crackling softly. The smell of burning wood filled the air, adding to the cozy atmosphere. I set my things down and immediately felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my things and decided to go for a quick walk before it got too dark. I stepped outside and walked along a small path that led into the woods. The air was crisp, the ground covered in fallen leaves. As I walked deeper into the trees, I noticed how the forest seemed to swallow up the sounds around me. The quiet was almost unnatural, as if the world had fallen completely still. It was disorienting, and a small, creeping sense of unease settled in my chest. I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just the isolation. After a short walk, I returned to the cabin and started making dinner. The night was falling quickly now, the wind picked up outside, rattling the cabin's wooden walls. The fire flickered and cast dancing shadows across the room. I ate alone, savoring the silence, but as the evening wore on, the stillness became oppressive. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I took a long shower, hoping the warm water would help me relax, but the unease that had been growing inside me all evening hadn't disappeared. When I climbed into bed, the silence was deafening. It felt like the walls of the cabin were closing in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation, just the mind playing tricks. But then I heard it, a faint knocking sound coming from somewhere in the cabin. It was so soft at first that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But then it came again, 3 distinct knocks, as if someone was tapping on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself, though, that it was just the wind. But the knock came again, 3 soft taps. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and slowly got up, tiptoeing to the door. I hesitated before opening it, wondering if I was just being paranoid. I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the door, but my gut told me otherwise. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The wind had died down and the air felt eerily still. There was nothing there, no movement, no sounds, just the empty, dark woods stretching out in front of me. I closed the door and locked it again, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd been hearing things, and I returned to bed. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued throughout the night, always the same, 3 soft taps. I buried my head under the covers, trying to ignore it, but the sound was persistent. It was coming from somewhere inside the cabin, though. Not the door this time. It was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere within the walls. The next morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The sun was out now, casting a warm golden light through the trees, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over me. The knocking had stopped when the sun came up, but the sense of something lurking just beyond the threshold remained. I spent the day walking around the cabin, trying to take my mind off the events of the night before. I explored the nearby stream and hiked along the trails, but something kept pulling at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The trees seemed to move in ways they shouldn't, casting long, twisted shadows across the path. It was as though the forest itself was alive. That night, I debated leaving, but I didn't want to be paranoid. I didn't want to run away from what might just be an overactive imagination. I stayed in, locked the doors, and tried to distract myself with a book. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside seemed to heighten my senses, making me jump at every little sound. Then around midnight, it started again. 3 knocks, soft, deliberate. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was nothing, but then came the voice, a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Come outside." I froze in place, my blood running cold. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no way anyone else was here. I was completely alone. "Come outside." It came again, clearer this time. The voice sounded close, just on the other side of the door. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed out of the room. My heart was racing as I made my way to the front door. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't reason with myself. Something was pulling me, urging me to open the door. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I touched the handle. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to stay inside, to leave the cabin and never look back. But the voice, soft and insistent, whispered again, "Come outside." I opened the door. The night was cold, and the forest outside was completely still. But something was different this time. There, in the shadows, just beyond the porch light, I saw a figure. Tall, thin, its features hidden by the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run back inside, but I was frozen. My body wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was dressed in tattered clothes, and its face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. "Why are you here?" it whispered. The voice sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. Before I could respond, the figure raised its hand and pointed to the woods. "Leave this place," it said, its voice low and hollow. "You don't belong here." I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't dare look back. I locked all the windows and doors, turned off the lights, and huddled in the corner of the room. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left before dawn. I never looked back. As I drove down the winding road, I could feel the eyes of the forest on me, following my every move. The wind howled through the trees, and the whispers seemed to follow me, growing louder as I left. I don't know who or what that thing was, but I know one thing for sure. I will never return to that cabin. Some places are best left untouched.
Next story.
I had never believed in ghosts. In fact, I used to laugh at the idea. Growing up, I was always the one to debunk every paranormal story my friends would share. But all that changed the weekend I spent at an old cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a weekend getaway with my girlfriend Claire and a couple of friends to celebrate my birthday. I had found the cabin through an online listing, and it seemed perfect for a group of us. Isolated, surrounded by nature, and affordable. The photos showed a beautiful, rustic log cabin with a big stone fireplace and a deck that overlooked a serene lake. It was exactly what we needed. But when we arrived, it was different. The cabin was older than I expected, and not in a charming, rustic way. It was worn down, like it had been abandoned for years. The wood was weathered, the front door barely hung on its hinges, and there was a distinct smell of mildew in the air. Still, we were there, so we shrugged it off. It was the weekend, and we were here to have fun. We unloaded the car and carried our bags inside, trying to shake off the strange feeling that was creeping over me. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just the deep silence of the woods around us. Perfect for a break from the noise of city life. But as I stepped inside, something about the cabin felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy. I couldn't explain it, just an odd sensation in the pit of my stomach. Claire noticed it too. "It's a little eerie, don't you think?" she said, looking around with a frown. I tried to laugh it off. "It's fine, just an old cabin, that's all." We all settled into the living room, unpacking snacks, cracking open beers, and deciding to make the best of it. As the evening wore on, the conversation flowed, but the strange feeling lingered. I kept hearing small noises, a creak in the floorboards, the occasional thud coming from somewhere in the cabin, but I chalked it up to the house settling. It wasn't until we went to bed that things really started to get weird. I was the first to wake up that night. It was around 2 a.m., and the cabin was pitch black, the only sound being the wind outside. I tossed and turned in the bed, unable to shake off a feeling of unease. I needed to use the bathroom, so I quietly slid out of bed and tiptoed through the dark hallway, trying not to wake anyone. As I passed the living room, I heard it, a soft voice just barely audible calling my name. "Jake." I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. I turned toward the sound, but there was no one in the living room. I was alone. But the voice, it wasn't loud. It wasn't frantic. It was soft, almost soothing. And it was coming from somewhere, inside the walls. I swallowed hard, convincing myself it was just the wind, a trick of my imagination. But then I heard it again. "Jake?" The voice was closer this time, more distinct. I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't move. The sound seemed to come from directly behind the wall near the fireplace. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just the old house, creaking and shifting in the night. Maybe it was just the wind whistling through the cracks. But then I heard it again. This time, the voice was more desperate. "Please, help me, Jake." That was enough. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I collapsed into bed, shaking, trying to tell myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't forget the voice, that desperate cry for help. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to act normal. Claire and the others didn't notice anything unusual, but I could barely hide the panic in my chest. I was convinced something was wrong with that place. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem crazy, so I kept it to myself. As the day went on, things got worse. We spent the afternoon hiking around the property, trying to shake off the eerie feeling, but it was impossible to escape it. Every time we passed the cabin, I could swear I saw movement in the windows, even though no one was inside. Shadows seemed to dart behind the curtains, and every creak in the house sent my heart racing. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled Claire aside. "I think we need to leave," I told her, my voice trembling. "Something's wrong with this place. I don't know how to explain it, but it's not right." She looked at me, concerned. "Jake, calm down. You're just overthinking things. It's just an old cabin." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps outside our bedroom door. My pulse spiked as I strained to hear. They were slow, deliberate. Someone or something was walking down the hallway. I held my breath, hoping it was one of my friends, but then I realized they were all in their rooms. No one else was awake. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. I waited in the silence, my mind racing. What was happening? And then it spoke. "Jake, help me." The voice again, the same soft whisper coming from right outside the door. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The voice sounded like it was right there on the other side of the door, desperate, pleading. But this time, it wasn't my name. It was calling. It was Claire's. "Claire, help me." I jumped out of bed, grabbing Claire by the arm and pulling her into the living room. She was groggy, confused, but I didn't care. We needed to get out of that place. I told her everything. The voice, the footsteps, how I felt like we were being watched. She didn't believe me at first, but after everything that had happened, she finally agreed we should leave. We woke up the others and rushed to pack our things, but the moment we stepped outside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the entire woods around us were holding their breath. As we walked to the car, I turned to look back at the cabin, and for a split second, I saw something in the window. A figure standing there, watching us. The door creaked open as if inviting us to return. But we didn't. We got in the car, and I drove like I'd never driven before, speeding down the winding roads, not looking back until we were miles away from that cursed place. I didn't even stop for gas until we reached the first town. When I asked the gas station attendant about the cabin, he looked at me with wide eyes and said, "You went to that old cabin, didn't you? The one by the lake? Folks say it's haunted. Some say there's something still trapped there, something that calls out for help, but never gets it. You shouldn't have stayed there. No one ever stays long." I didn't need to hear anything else. We never went back. To this day, I can still hear the voice calling out to me in my dreams. And sometimes, just when I think I'm alone, I hear it again. "Help me."
Next story.
It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, a break from the stresses of city life, a chance to relax, breathe in the fresh air, and disconnect from everything. I'd seen the listing for the cabin online, tucked away in a quiet part of the Appalachian Mountains. The pictures were charming. Wooden beams, a stone fireplace, huge windows with a view of the trees. The owners described it as a peaceful haven, far removed from the noise of civilization. I hadn't realized how much I needed that break until we arrived. It was just me and a couple of friends, Mark and Lila. We all needed to recharge, so the plan was simple. Hike, cook, laugh, drink, sleep, repeat. We were excited, and for the first few hours, it felt like exactly what we needed. The cabin was far from modern, old, yes, but clean and well-maintained. We each picked our rooms and settled in. I took the room at the far end of the hallway, next to the staircase. The windows were wide, overlooking a thick forest. There was something eerie about it, but in a good way. A perfect place to get lost in your thoughts. We spent the evening by the fire, telling ghost stories, drinking wine, and making fun of all the cheesy horror films we had seen in our youth. The storm rolling in didn't bother me, at least not at first. I welcomed the howling winds and the occasional crack of thunder. It made everything feel more alive. Lila, always the one to get scared easily, kept talking about how she'd heard stories of cabins like this, how people would disappear, how weird things would happen in the middle of nowhere, how the forest always seemed to hold its secrets. We laughed it off, of course. Nothing ever happens like that in real life, right? We went to bed late that night. The wind was picking up, rattling the old windows. I could hear the creaking of the house, the occasional groan of the wood settling into the cold. But after a while, it became a comforting sound. I had no idea how much it would change in the morning. The first odd thing happened around 3 a.m. I woke up to a sound, soft, like a tapping. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the window. It was dark, the kind of dark you only get in the middle of nowhere, no lights for miles. I tried to ignore it, but the sound came again, this time louder, more urgent. Tap, tap, tap. I slid out of bed and walked toward the door, still trying to convince myself that it was just the wind. I crept down the hallway, my bare feet barely making a sound. Mark's door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him snoring softly, so it wasn't him. But there, at the foot of the stairs, something caught my eye. A shadow. A figure stood at the base of the staircase, just standing there, motionless. It was tall, but its shape was difficult to make out in the dark. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to believe it, but it was there. It wasn't Lila, and it wasn't Mark. My heart was racing now, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I just stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure shifted, slowly, deliberately, as if it had sensed my gaze. Then it vanished. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood there for what felt like hours trying to calm myself down, but I couldn't. I turned and rushed back to my room, slamming the door behind me, my pulse still hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I told Mark and Lila about what I saw, but they didn't seem as concerned as I had hoped. They figured it was my imagination or a trick of the light, but I knew what I saw. We spent the day hiking, but something felt off. I kept seeing things in the trees, shapes that moved when I wasn't looking. At times, I could swear I heard whispering, like voices carried on the wind, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The tension between us was palpable, but no one said anything. We kept walking, kept pretending everything was fine. That night, as we gathered around the fire, I noticed something even stranger. The forest was quieter than it should have been. The usual night sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, were absent. There was only the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind. Lila was the first to mention it. "Have you noticed that the forest is silent?" she asked, looking over her shoulder at the blackness beyond the cabin. Mark laughed nervously. "It's probably just the storm. You know how it is." But I didn't think it was just the storm. It felt wrong, as if something was watching us, waiting for the right moment. We decided to go inside early, feeling the oppressive silence pressing on us. As we were heading in, though, I caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the tree line. It was quick, but I could have sworn I saw a figure, tall, thin, and shadowy, stalking through the trees. I rushed inside without saying a word. Mark and Lila followed, oblivious to what I had seen. That night, things took a darker turn. I woke up again around 3 a.m., but this time it wasn't the tapping, it was something far worse. A loud bang, like something heavy had crashed against the side of the house. The walls shook and the windows rattled as if a strong gust of wind had slammed into the cabin. My heart thudded in my chest. This wasn't the storm. This was something else. I jumped out of bed, my legs shaky, and rushed into the hallway. The sound had come from downstairs. Mark's door was wide open now, and I could hear Lila's voice calling out softly from the living room. I crept down the stairs, like every creak of the wood beneath my feet sending waves of terror through my body. The living room was dim, lit only by the flickering light from the fireplace, but there was something off. The air felt colder than it should have been. The furniture seemed to be cast in strange, twisted shadows. And then I saw it. At the far side of the room by the window, there was a figure, but it wasn't a person. It was something darker, something unnatural. It was standing, watching us. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its features distorted by the flickering light. It was wearing a black coat, its hands hanging loosely at its sides, fingers elongated and unnatural. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, paralyzed by the sight of it. And then it turned. Slowly, it faced me, its eyes glowing faintly, like two pits of darkness staring right through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I finally managed to take a step back. That's when the whispering began. It was soft at first, like the wind whispering through the trees, but then it grew louder, more distinct. Words. Voices. "Get out." The voice came from all around me, filling the room with a suffocating presence. It wasn't just one voice, it was hundreds, all saying the same thing, repeating it over and over. Get out. Leave now. I turned and ran back upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door behind me and curled into a ball in the bed, trembling with fear. The next morning, we packed up and left without a word. We didn't talk about it, none of us did. But none of us looked back at the cabin, not even once. As we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for just a split second, I thought I saw it, standing at the window watching us go.
Next story.
I've always been a skeptic. Growing up, I'd read horror novels and watched plenty of ghost movies, but I never truly believed in any of it. That is, until I took a trip to a remote cabin in the mountains with some friends. Looking back, I wish I had stayed home. We were a group of 5, me, my childhood friends, Sarah, Ben, Tim, and Lara. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, a way to reconnect, get away from the grind of daily life, and enjoy a weekend in the wilderness. The cabin was an old, isolated structure, one that didn't look like it had been touched in years. It was nestled high in the mountains, surrounded by thick woods, far from any nearby town or even other cabins. The kind of place where you could completely escape, or so we thought. When we first arrived, the cabin looked picturesque, like something you'd see on the cover of a magazine. Wooden walls, large glass windows with a panoramic view of the forest, a stone fireplace that promised warmth on cold nights. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. Everything seemed perfect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was subtle at first, just a slight unease that grew the longer we stayed. We spent the first day hiking through the woods, enjoying the silence of the mountains. But as the sun began to set and we returned to the cabin, things started to feel off. There was a heavy stillness in the air, like the forest had gone completely silent, which in retrospect was strange for such a thick, wild place. The trees didn't move, the wind didn't blow. It was as though nature itself had decided to hold its breath. That night, after dinner, we sat around the fireplace, sharing stories and laughing. The flickering firelight danced across the walls, casting strange, shifting shadows. But as the evening wore on, I noticed something. Ben, who had been the most talkative of us, suddenly went quiet. He was staring at the wall, his face pale, his expression distant. "Ben, you okay?" I asked, a slight tension rising in my chest. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at the wall like he hadn't heard me. Finally, he turned to us, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone, in the woods." At first, we all laughed, thinking he was just messing with us. But when he insisted, I felt a chill run down my spine. He wasn't joking. Ben had always been the practical one in our group, the type of person who would never entertain ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. So to hear him say something like that, it didn't sit right with me. "Ben, you're freaking us out," Sarah said, trying to make light of the situation. "There's no one out there. It's just trees." But Ben shook his head. "No, I saw someone watching us at the edge of the clearing." The room fell silent. We all turned toward the window, but all we could see was the dark, empty forest. Still, the tension hung heavy in the air. Ben didn't seem like he was joking, and the weight of his words pressed down on us. After a few moments, Tim stood up and said, "All right, let's go check it out. If someone's out there, we should at least know who it is." We grabbed a couple of flashlights and stepped out into the cold night air. The cabin was dark behind us, and the forest stretched endlessly before us. The beams of our flashlights sliced through the blackness, revealing the twisted trunks of trees and thick underbrush. We ventured a little deeper into the woods, but after a while, we didn't see anything. "See?" I said, trying to reassure myself as much as Ben. "Nothing here." But as I spoke, a rustling sound came from the bushes behind us. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the noise. At first, all I saw was shadows, and then I caught sight of something moving, quickly, darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" Lara whispered, clutching onto Tim's arm. Her voice was full of fear. Ben was already moving toward the sound, his eyes wide. I told you someone's out here." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran back toward the cabin, fear pounding in our chests. When we reached the porch, we slammed the door shut behind us, hearts racing. But there was no comfort in the cabin's walls. The air was thick, and the silence outside had returned, more suffocating than before. We sat around the fireplace in uneasy silence, no one daring to speak. I kept glancing at the windows, convinced that something was watching us just beyond the glass. My nerves were on edge, and every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls made my skin crawl. Around midnight, we decided to head to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises, scratching sounds like something dragging across the wooden walls. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't feel right. The noises were too deliberate, too methodical. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket over my head, but then I heard something else. A voice, a soft whispering, so faint it was almost imperceptible, coming from the corner of the room. "Help me." I froze. My blood ran cold. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, if it was some trick of the wind, but it was too real, too clear. My heart raced in my chest as I sat up, trying to gather my thoughts. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." I shot out of bed and ran into the living room, my feet barely touching the ground. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be alone, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I found the others huddled together, pale-faced and wide-eyed. "Did you hear it?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her lip quivering. "I heard it too. It's coming from the walls." We all stared at each other, fear paralyzing us. None of us wanted to investigate, but none of us dared to go back to our rooms. We didn't sleep that night, not a single one of us. The next morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could, not even bothering to check out or make sure everything was in order. We just wanted to get as far away from that cabin as possible. As we drove down the mountain, I glanced back at the cabin in my rearview mirror, watching it grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the trees. When we got back to the city, I tried to forget the horrors of that night. But sometimes when the wind howls just right, or when I find myself in an old, secluded place, I hear the whisper again, the faint, desperate plea. "Help me."
Next story.
I had always dreamed of spending time alone in the woods. The isolation, the quiet, the opportunity to clear my head, it all seemed so perfect. That's why, when I found a secluded cabin nestled deep in the forest, I didn't hesitate. The listing described it as a rustic retreat with no neighbors for miles, a place where you could truly get away from everything. No phones, no distractions, just nature. The moment I arrived, I could feel the weight of the silence. It was different from the usual quiet of the woods. It was almost oppressive, like the trees were holding their breath. But I told myself it was nothing. I was here to relax, not to be paranoid. I checked the cabin, an old two-story structure with weathered wood and a stone chimney. It was beautiful, in its own way, if you liked the worn-in, weather-beaten look. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a fresh, clean scent. It seemed peaceful at first, but when I stepped inside, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The floors creaked as I moved through the cabin. The walls were covered with old photographs, families, smiling faces, some so faded you could barely make them out. In the living room, there was an old leather couch and a fireplace that looked as though it hadn't been used in years. The place had an air of neglect, but that only added to its charm. I set my bags down and decided to explore the surrounding forest. It felt strange, being this far from civilization. The trees were thick, almost oppressive, and the trail was barely a path at all, more like a suggestion of one overgrown with brambles and vines. I didn't mind, though. I liked the sense of adventure. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice something odd. There were no animal sounds, no birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush. It was just still. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. I tried to shake off the growing unease, but something about the stillness gnawed at me. I wandered for hours, but nothing seemed familiar. The forest stretched on, thick and endless, a labyrinth of trees that seemed to close in around me the further I went. I had meant to be gone for just an hour, but I had lost track of time. The sky above was turning gray, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon. The temperature dropped, and I started to feel the weight of the wilderness around me. I turned back, but the path that had seemed so clear on my way out was now gone. The trees were closing in tighter, the underbrush more dense. Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried to stay calm, but every direction I turned felt unfamiliar. Every shadow seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't long before I realized I was lost. As the darkness crept in, I started calling out, hoping anyone would hear me. But there was no answer, not even an echo. The silence was suffocating. I stumbled through the woods, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, through the trees, I saw it. The cabin. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. How could I have circled back to the cabin so quickly? But as I drew closer, I saw the familiar weathered walls and the chimney puffing a faint wisp of smoke into the air. Relief flooded through me. I had found it. I was safe. I rushed up to the door, eager to get inside and warm up, but when I turned the knob, it wouldn't open. I pulled again, harder, but the door remained stubbornly shut. My pulse quickened. This couldn't be happening. The cabin had been open when I left. I checked the back, the windows, everything was locked. It was as if the cabin itself had turned its back on me. I couldn't stay out here. I had to get in. In a panic, I went to the front window, peering inside. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure moving in the shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone. I couldn't tell if it had been my eyes playing tricks or if there was something in there with me. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from behind me. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, but no one was there. Just the trees, standing tall and silent as ever. I turned back to the cabin, desperate, and knocked hard on the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. The footsteps continued, but they weren't coming from behind me. They were coming from inside the cabin. I froze, my blood turning to ice. There was no mistaking it. Someone or something was moving around in there. The sound of footsteps shuffling across the floor, the creak of the stairs, the low murmur of voices. I could hear it all, muffled through the walls. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I heard something else, a whisper. Leave. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it was unmistakable. I wasn't alone, and whatever was inside that cabin wanted me gone. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay there. I didn't care if I was lost again. I had to get away from that cabin. I ran through the trees, not stopping to look back, not daring to glance behind me. The sound of footsteps followed me, never stopping, always just a step behind. I ran until I could no longer hear them. When I finally stopped, breathless and terrified, I found myself on the edge of a clearing. The forest stretched out before me, the trees parting like a curtain, but there was no cabin in sight. The clearing was empty. The sky had darkened to a deep blue, and the air was thick with tension. I sat down on the ground, trying to steady my breathing, but my heart wouldn't slow. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard, about the whispers, about the footsteps. Then, just as I thought I was alone, I looked up, and there it was, the cabin. It stood in the distance, like a dark silhouette against the fading light, the same weathered wood, the same chimney puffing smoke into the air. But it wasn't the cabin I had left. It was the same, and yet it wasn't. The door was open. I ran. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I made it back to the car just as the first stars began to appear in the sky. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I just drove. Away from the woods, away from the cabin, away from whatever was lurking in the shadows. I've never gone back, and I never will.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me and my girlfriend, Zoe, escaping the chaos of everyday life and spending a couple of days at an old cabin in the woods. We'd rented it from a local man who'd claimed it was a peaceful retreat. I believed him at first. It was remote, nestled deep in a valley, surrounded by dense forest. No neighbors for miles, no distractions, just nature and the quiet hum of solitude. Perfect for a relaxing getaway. Zoe and I had arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The cabin was quaint, with wooden beams running across the ceiling and a stone fireplace in the center of the living room. The scent of aged pine filled the air, and everything felt timeless, untouched by modern life. There were no TVs, no internet, just a few books scattered across a table and a record player in the corner. The perfect escape, or so it seemed. As we unpacked our things and settled in, Zoe commented on how cozy it felt. but something about the place seemed off. It wasn't exactly creepy, but there was a strange energy in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I brushed it off, figuring I was just letting my imagination run wild. After all, we were here to relax, not worry about things that weren't real. We spent the first evening sitting by the fire, enjoying a bottle of wine and talking about everything and nothing. Zoe was always the more adventurous one, always up for exploring new places. So, after dinner, we decided to take a walk around the property. It was dark, the moonlight barely filtering through the canopy of trees above us, casting long shadows on the ground. We followed a narrow path that wound through the woods behind the cabin, the air crisp and fresh. As we walked, Zoe pointed out strange markings on the trees, circles of broken bark, like something had been gnawing at them. "It looks like animal tracks," she said, but there was something unsettling about the pattern, like no animal I knew would carve up trees like that. Still, I tried not to let my imagination get the best of me. Nature does strange things. We ventured deeper into the woods, the path becoming less defined as we went. The farther we walked, the heavier the air felt and the more distant the cabin seemed. The trees around us began to feel suffocating, like they were closing in, and the chirping of insects and rustling of leaves faded into an eerie silence. My phone had no signal, and the darkness felt thicker out here. Suddenly, Zoe stopped. I turned to see her standing still, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I listened. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the quiet of the woods. But then it came again, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was distant at first, like someone was knocking on a door, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to echo through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. "Maybe it's just a woodpecker," I suggested, trying to calm her nerves, but even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The sound didn't feel natural. Zoe's grip tightened on my arm, and I could feel her pulse racing. "No, this isn't right. We should go back." I agreed. We turned around, heading back toward the cabin, but the path seemed different now. It was harder to follow, as though the trees were shifting, blocking our way. The tapping sound was still there, only now it was closer than ever. We quickened our pace, but every time we took a step, the noise followed. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone, or something, was keeping time with us, matching our movements. Panic began to rise in my chest as we stumbled through the woods, but no matter how fast we walked, we couldn't seem to outrun the sound. Then, through the trees, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, a silhouette standing perfectly still. My heart skipped a beat. It was a figure, a tall man, or at least it looked like one. But something was off about him. He stood in the middle of the path, unmoving, his face hidden by the shadows of the trees. The tapping sound had stopped, but now there was an oppressive silence, a stillness so thick it felt like the air itself had frozen. I called out to him, my voice shaky. "Hey, are you lost?" But there was no response. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching us. "Let's go now," Zoe whispered urgently, pulling at my sleeve, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. Something about the way he stood there, so unnaturally still, made my stomach turn. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Suddenly, without warning, the figure turned and walked deeper into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened. Then, without thinking, I bolted, grabbing Zoe's hand, pulling her toward the cabin as fast as I could. We finally reached the cabin, breathless and terrified, and slammed the door behind us. Zoe collapsed onto the couch, her face pale, her hands trembling. I couldn't seem to get enough air into my lungs. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. We didn't leave the cabin that night. In fact, we didn't leave for the next 2 days. Every time we looked outside, the woods seemed darker, more oppressive. We never saw the figure again, but the feeling of being watched never went away. And the tapping, oh God, the tapping, seemed to echo in our minds even when we were inside. The last night we were there, we heard it again. It wasn't from the woods this time. It was from the walls. The cabin itself seemed to breathe with that same rhythm, as if the entire structure was alive and pulsing in time with the tap-tap-tapping. It was as though the figure had followed us back, making its way into the very bones of the cabin. The next morning, we left without a word to the owner. I didn't even go inside to return the key. We just piled into the car, drove back down the mountain and didn't stop until we hit the first town. I never did find out who or what that figure was or what it wanted, but I know this. There's something in those woods, something that's been there a long time, something that waits, watching, listening for anyone who dares to wander too close. And it's still out there, somewhere, waiting. I'll never go back.
Next story.
I'm writing this because I need someone to know what happened, even if it sounds insane. If I don't make it out of here, maybe this story will survive, even if I don't. It started a week ago. My friend Tommy inherited an old cabin from his uncle, an uncle he barely knew, who passed away suddenly. It wasn't much, just a small place out in the Appalachian Mountains, but Tommy was thrilled about it. He invited me and a few others to spend the weekend there with him. "It'll be fun," he said. "We'll drink, grill some food, and just chill out in the middle of nowhere." It sounded harmless, so I said yes. The drive was long, winding up narrow, tree-lined roads, far from any signs of civilization. The cabin was exactly what you'd expect, a small, creaky structure surrounded by dense woods. It looked like it had been plucked straight out of a postcard from the 1950s, with faded shutters and an old stone chimney. When we arrived, Tommy was already there with his girlfriend, Sarah. Another couple, Mark and Jess, showed up a little later. The five of us were ready to make a weekend of it until we found the cellar door. It was Mark who discovered it, half buried under a pile of rotting leaves behind the cabin. At first, we thought it was just an old storm cellar. The wooden door was warped with age, and the rusted hinges creaked when Mark pulled it open. It led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Creepy," Sarah said, laughing nervously. "Do you think there's anything down there?" "Probably just junk," Tommy shrugged. "Old tools or something." But Mark, being Mark, insisted we check it out. He grabbed a flashlight from the cabin and led the way, with the rest of us reluctantly following. The air grew colder as we descended, and the smell of damp earth filled the narrow space. At the bottom was a single room. The walls were made of rough stone, and the floor was dirt. It was empty, except for a single wooden table in the center, and what looked like markings carved into the walls. At first, we thought they were just scratches, but when we looked closer, we realized they were symbols. Strange, looping symbols that none of us recognized. "I don't like this," Jess whispered. "Let's go back upstairs." But Mark, ever the skeptic, laughed. "It's just some old carvings. Maybe Tommy's uncle was into weird art or something." Tommy didn't respond. He was staring at the table, his face pale. "I don't think my uncle ever came down here," he said quietly. "He was terrified of basements. Always said they creeped him out." We left soon after, the mood heavier than when we'd arrived. That night, we tried to brush it off. We lit a fire in the fireplace, grilled some burgers, and drank a little too much. By the time we went to bed, we'd almost forgotten about the cellar. Almost. That night, I woke up to a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch hitting the side of the cabin, but then I realized it was coming from inside, from beneath the floor. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random. It had a pattern, like someone was trying to communicate. I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed and crept into the hallway. The cabin was silent, except for that tapping sound. That's when I saw Sarah. She was standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the floor. Her back was to me, and her shoulders were stiff, like she was listening to something. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Slowly, I moved closer, reaching out to touch her shoulder. The moment I did, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her face was pale as death. "They're underneath us," she whispered. Before I could respond, she collapsed. I caught her just in time and shouted for the others. They came running, panic in their eyes. We got Sarah onto the couch, and she eventually woke up, but she couldn't explain what had happened. She just kept mumbling about voices and scratching. The next day, we decided to leave. Tommy protested, saying it was just Sarah being dramatic, but the rest of us weren't willing to stay another night. We packed up our things and loaded the cars, ready to get out of there. But when we tried to leave, the cars wouldn't start. Not Tommy's. Not Mark's. Both vehicles were dead, even though they'd been working fine the day before. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. We were stuck. That night, the tapping returned. It wasn't just beneath the floor this time. It was on the walls, the windows, the doors. The sound came from everywhere, growing louder and faster until it felt like the entire cabin was alive with it. And then we heard the whispers. Faint at first, like a breeze slipping through the cracks, but they grew louder, more distinct. They weren't in English or any language I'd ever heard. It was guttural, low, and filled with malice. The symbols from the cellar flashed in my mind, and I realized they were connected. Whatever was down there wasn't human. The whispers turned into screams. Sarah was the first to break. She started crying, clutching her head and rocking back and forth. Mark grabbed a chair and swung it at the door, trying to break it down, but it wouldn't budge. Jess and I huddled in the corner, too terrified to move. And then the door to the cellar slammed open. We hadn't touched it since we found it, but now it stood wide open, revealing the dark staircase below. The air turned icy, and a foul stench wafted up from the depths. The whispers were louder now, echoing from the cellar like a chorus of the damned. Something moved in the shadows. I didn't see it clearly, but I felt it. A presence, ancient and malevolent, crawling up the stairs. I screamed for everyone to run, but no one moved. They were frozen in place, their eyes locked on the darkness spilling out of the cellar. The last thing I remember is a hand, long, thin, and pale as ash, reaching up from the shadows. I woke up in the woods the next morning, alone. The cabin was gone. My friends were gone. The only thing left was the sound of the wind and the faint, rhythmic tapping, following me wherever I go.